Three, two, one, here we go. RAINMAN'S Take podcast. Observations on the world we live in. My take on current events and other topics of interest. Also interviews with some really cool people. So let's get the conversation going. Hey everybody, it's the Rain Man. Got a great episode for you today. We're going to be talking about New York Representative George Santos and the current state of politics in Washington, D.C. right now. And before I get into that, though, I would like to give a big shout out to all of you who are part of the Rain Man's Take community. Thank you very much. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I know you're going to love the content. So go ahead and hit the like button and also hit the subscribe button, which you're going to find at the lower right-hand corner of your screen. That's going to help me out with the YouTube algorithm so that I can get this product out or get the content out to more people and build the community. I would really appreciate that. So what am I trying to do here at Rain Man's Take? Basically, what I'm trying to do is build a community of people who are curious, who are interested in different topics, politics, geopolitics, history, war, current events, whatever the case may be. They're curious to know more. They want to know more. Maybe they read something in the newspaper or watch something on television and they're thinking to themselves, I'm not getting the whole story here. I need more information. I want to know more about this particular subject. And what I do at Rain Man's Take is I do a couple things. One, like I'm doing today, is I'll take a subject and I'll really dissect it and try to figure out what's going on and kind of give my opinion of what I think is happening. And then I also, on other episodes, will bring in a subject matter expert as well. We'll do a deep dive into whatever it is that we're talking about that day. So, that's kind of Rain Man's Take, and I really appreciate you being a part of the community. And with that being said, let's go ahead and start off with what I think of currently what's going on in Washington. So today's episode is about the George Santos situation and how it's emblematic, I feel, of the serious problems in our political system. My initial take for this episode was going to be a very partisan one. Basically, my feeling was that Republicans are better than this, and this shouldn't happen to the side that I most agree with. Now, my angle was going to be, I want to see the Republicans do the right thing and get rid of this guy. I want to see them take the near-term political hit. Now, even if Santos is replaced, I believe this to be the case, even if he is replaced by a Democrat, I still believe the Republicans hold the majority in the House. Regardless, I want them to do that, then move on and be better for it because they've kept some level of integrity. Now, the problem with that, and obviously there are exceptions, of course, is right now there are some in the Republican Party who are doing the exact same thing as the Democrats, and it's actually, they are not better than that right now. I know this to be the harsh reality of Washington, D.C., and that's why I started Rain Man's Take in the first place, and I'm constantly preaching about understanding both sides of an issue. I want people to understand both sides of the issue and get themselves as informed as possible. And then once we've made an informed conclusion and formed a position, well, then we can try and hold these politicians accountable for questionable actions in the future. So as I was researching the idea that it's Democrats right now that have the market on unscrupulous politicians who lie and cheat with zero accountability, I realized that there is also many Republicans that have done the same thing. And, of course, obviously Santos comes to mind. However, I do feel that Democrats still protect their own, and many have not been held accountable. It seems embellishing one's resume to get into D.C. is par for the course. But even when those embellishments are exposed, it still doesn't seem to matter, and I have a real problem with that. Case in point, Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal and his embellishment of his military experiences during, not in, the Vietnam War. And I'm going to take from an article here from the New York Times titled "Richard Blumenthal's Words on Vietnam Service Differ from History." And this was written by Raymond Hernandez, and it's from May 17, 2010. The article states, at a ceremony honoring veterans, Attorney General Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut rose and spoke of an earlier time in his life. He says, "We have learned something important since the days that I served in Vietnam." Mr. Blumenthal said to the group, and you exemplify it, whatever we think about the war, whatever we call it, Afghanistan or Iraq, we owe our military men and women unconditional support. There was only one problem. Mr. Blumenthal, a Democrat now running for the United States Senate, never served in Vietnam. He obtained at least 5 military deferments from 1965 to 1970 and took repeated steps that enabled him to avoid going to war. But what is striking about Mr. Blumenthal's record is the contrast between the many steps he took that allowed him to avoid Vietnam and the misleading way he often speaks about that period of his life now, especially when he is speaking at veteran ceremonies or other patriotic events. Continuing on with the article here. Sometimes his remarks have been plainly untrue, as in his speech at the group in Newark. At other times, he has used more ambiguous language, but the impression left on audiences can be similar. In an interview on Monday, the Attorney General said that he has misspoken about his service during the Norwalk event and might have misspoken on other occasions. My intention has always been to be completely clear and accurate and straightforward, out of respect to the veterans who served in Vietnam, he said. But as an examination of his remarks at the ceremonies shows that he does not volunteer that his service never took him overseas. And he describes the hostile reaction directed at veterans coming back from Vietnam, intimating that he was among them. In 2003, he addressed a rally in Bridgeport where about 100 military families gathered to express support for American troops overseas. He says, "When we returned, we saw nothing like this," Mr. Blumenthal said. "Let us do better by this generation of men and women." So I make use of this example because as a veteran, this really angers me. It has to do with the idea of stolen valor, and to me, it's an unforgivable sin, one that should disqualify someone from office. But again, it seems embellishing one's background is par for the course right now in D.C. Now, I'll point out as well that in the recent last February or November, in the recent congressional elections in Ohio, Republican candidate R Majewski was also caught embellishing his military record. And I quote from an article here, from an AP article titled, "Ohio GOP House Senator Has Misrepresented Military Service." And this one was written by Brian Sladisco and James Laporta from September 22nd, 2022. Now, quoting the article here, campaigning for a northwestern Ohio congressional seat, Republican R Majewski represented himself as an Air Force combat veteran who deployed to Afghanistan after 9/11 terrorist attacks, once describing tough conditions, including a lack of running water that forced him to go more than 40 days without a shower. Military documents obtained by the Associated Press through a public records request tell a different story. They indicate Majewski never deployed to Afghanistan, but instead completed a 6-month stint helping to load planes at an airbase in Qatar, a longtime U.S. ally that is a safe distance from the fighting. Majewski's account of his time in the military is just one aspect of his biography that is suspect. So, continuing on here, food for thought. Majewski lost, and Blumenthal is in his 13th year in the U.S. Senate. So, think about that. So that is the reason I changed the angle of this episode. What I wanted to do is talk about the George Santos situation because it just reinforces, in my view, how broken D.C. is. It's no wonder Congress and the swamp have such a low approval ratings nationally. The image that is portrayed from D.C. is that of a corrupt cesspool of people who most citizens would not want their children to grow up to emulate. And that is the problem. The system is currently attracting these types of people, if it hasn't been doing so from the very beginning, which probably has. Huge egos, yes, but I'd go even further, and I'd say sociopaths. I mean, who doesn't think that the amount of lying George Santos was engaged in was not going to get caught? And the same with Blumenthal and others. So this is what really disappoints me about the current state of affairs. When situations like the George Santos election occur, my initial reaction is, what were these people thinking? And here, I'm not talking about Santos. I'm talking about the people who run the New York Republican Party. These are the ones who let this happen. The citizens are basically at the end of a whip. I mean, they're relying on the party to vet these candidates so that once the candidate is on the ballot or on to the next stage of an election, people assume that the individual has been vetted. And obviously this was not the case. So it almost feels like the New York Republican Party, to me, was trying to find someone who would placate the current woke trends, and Santos seemed to fit the bill. He's Latino, homosexual, and Jewish. The problem was that aside from having Brazilian parents who were living in Queens, New York when he was born, and the fact that he is gay, pretty much everything else about his background were lies, and that includes being Jewish. So to make the situation worse, in my view, is in this instance, even after the news broke, some residents in the district said it didn't bother them about Santos's actions because they felt he was the best candidate to look after their best interests. This is funny because a friend of mine and I were having a discussion about this situation recently, and he made a hilarious comment. He said, how do they know he's going to represent their best interests or have their best interests in mind? He's lied about everything else. And so I see people not holding our politicians accountable as a very big problem. If they don't care about these transgressions, then why should the politicians? After all, everybody's doing it, right? So I hate to sound like the boy crying wolf, but people need to take a more active role in this process so we can hopefully send the right people to DC. And when I say that, I'm not referring to Santos's ethnicity or sexual orientation. I'm saying we need people with character, integrity, not sociopaths. And yes, there are obviously people who have high character and integrity in those demographics. People need to be vetted properly, and that's every candidate regardless, and not just rubber stamped because they fit an image of what the Republicans need. We need the right candidates regardless of their sex, ethnicity, etc. Thankfully, in my view, George Santos is currently the subject of an ethics investigation by the House of Representatives. So we'll see how that goes. When things like this happen, or you hear about any number of politicians and their issues, I believe it makes people apathetic to the election process. And I almost feel like it's, well, F it. If that's the best we have, then that's the best we have. And to me, that apathy leads to not caring. And when people don't care, they don't pay attention to what our elected officials are doing. And then you get things like this insane Inflation Reduction Act, which is a massive spending bill that will actually create more inflation. And also the omnibus spending bill that they just passed recently with Republican Senate support, I might add. So it's not just Democrats, it's everyone. When the system seems so ingrained and there doesn't seem to be any way to fix it, there's a level of resignation that seeps in. The vast majority of politicians are good people, but they also operate as part of an established order in DC. And at some level, you have to be part of the system or else you just don't last very long. And again, that's just the reality of it. The established system I'm talking about is the status quo for the bureaucracies. And that inevitably means government keeps getting bigger, more powerful, and hungrier for more. And as that happens, the individual citizen and their rights get smaller and less important. And I'm paraphrasing Dennis Prager there, but I do not think that this is a good thing for us citizens. The way the system is set up right now, with the amount of money and the competing interests involved, the egomaniacs and the sociopaths show up because they are easily influenced by the money and power. And to the point where I feel they become puppets for the real power pulling the strings. It's no secret that I am against pretty much everything the current progressive Democratic platform is all about. And I say to myself, as these very debilitating policies get promoted and implemented, that these people in DC cannot be this stupid or incompetent. They must know how bad these policies are for us citizens. So the only conclusion that I can draw is that they want these negative outcomes. The reality is they know exactly what they're doing, and it is by design, and they agree with it. Now, whose design is the real question that we should be asking? Who is really pulling the strings in DC? America already doesn't look like it did even 40 years ago. And in my view, if it keeps going in this direction, the ideals that made America such an amazing force, or as Reagan described it, the shining city on the hill, will be completely gone. And it will make her ripe for the picking for forces who wish to see America knock down a few pegs on the international stage. So I know this sounds apocalyptic, and I know I'm being very pessimistic right now. But I only see a very few people in D.C. who are telling it like it is. And I know those individuals are themselves not perfect, and they probably have their own issues, but at least they seem to be trying. As you can imagine, all of those people that I'm thinking about are on the R side of the aisle. Now, as I say these words, I must sound like a naive dreamer. Someone looking for that libertarian utopia or Gulch, where the citizens are active in their own governing and everyone has the integrity and character required for such a society to thrive. Now, obviously, as a big shout out to Ayn Rand. So what do I think needs to be done to fix Washington, D.C.? The answer is many things, but here are three that I think will be very important. One, a limit on consecutive terms served for all branches of government, not just the president. Two, serious campaign reform. And three, U.S. citizens need to be more informed about what's happening. So first, limiting consecutive terms served is a great place to start to break up the career political class in D.C. A current example of this is Dianne Feinstein, a senator from California. She's 90 years old and only just recently decided not to run for re-election after over 30 years in D.C. Now, it should piss a lot of people off that many politicians finish their time in D.C. significantly wealthier than they were when they first got there. So my impression is the longer one is in D.C., the more they uphold the status quo because it benefits them. And that becomes the priority instead of their constituents. I've never worked in D.C., so my observations here are just casual observations from a concerned outsider. But when someone who has worked in D.C. tries to tell me, well, Brian, that's just the way it is, the way it's always been in D.C., I always remember a great interview I watched several years ago. The interview was with a former representative and a lobbyist. Now, I'm paraphrasing here just because it's been a while, but basically, when asked what is one thing that can be done to limit the amount of influence lobbyists have in D.C., and when I say lobbyists, think moneyed interests looking to influence policy. The lobbyist's answer was great. He said term limits. The reason is that it takes a lot of time, money, and effort to win over the support of a member of Congress. But once those relationships are made, they are very easy to maintain. And what he said was, if lobbyists had to put out that much money and energy every few years to win over new members, well, maybe their influence might not be nearly as great. Additionally, limiting consecutive terms served would allow citizens to better understand their representatives and their positions. And again, I'm thinking of campaign debates here because it's interesting to note that it may seem like I'm pouncing on Feinstein here, but according to a CNN politics article, and I'll read it here, and this is from Maeve Reston from October 2018, says Democratic Dianne Feinstein debated a general election opponent for the first time in nearly 2 decades on Wednesday night, with her challenger, California State Senator Kevin DeLeon, arguing forcefully that it was time for new leadership in D.C. That is crazy to me. One politician who I admired was Tom Coburn of Oklahoma. Coburn was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1994 as part of Newt Gingrich's Republican Revolution. He upheld his campaign pledge to serve no more than 3 consecutive terms and did not run for re-election in 2000. In 2004, he returned to political life with a successful run for the United States Senate. Coburn was re-elected to a second term in 2010 and kept his pledge not to seek a third term in 2016. I love that he pledged to term limit himself and returned to a civilian life as a physician, before getting back into politics. While in Congress, he was known for trying to make government more accountable and transparent. Now, it should be said here that a lot of people had problems with him because he had very conservative social positions, but he was very effective in shining a light on how corrupt and wasteful Washington, D.C. is. So Second is campaign reform. And I'm primarily talking about campaign finance reform because the money involved has just gotten crazy. According to a OpenSecrets.org, which is a group that follows money in politics, and I'm going to read from that article here. The article is titled Most Expensive Ever, 2020 Election Costs $14.4 billion by Carl Everson Hillstrom. From February 2021, quote, political spending in the 2020 election totaled $14.4 billion, more than doubling the total cost of the record-breaking 2016 presidential election cycle. And that's according to OpenSecrets analysis of Federal Election Commission filings. Now, I'd also love to see other campaign reforms that touch on the duration of each campaign season, as well as requiring a certain number of debates before Election Day. And then finally, Election Day itself should be one day, period. Since COVID, there were emergency procedures put in place regarding elections that has drawn the process out way longer than it has ever been, which inevitably, in my view, leads to accusations of tampering with the process. I really like Glenn Greenwald and read a lot of his stuff on Substack. Anyway, he had a great tweet during the last elections in Brazil, where he lives and whose population is about 66% of the United States. Brazil is 214 million, and the U.S. is 330 million. Anyway, his tweet simply said, and I'm going to read it right here, Election Day in Brazil today. The polls closed at 5 p.m. local time. The full results will be out and certified tonight. Many elections in the U.S. take weeks or months for there to be a full count. And the California primary took months. This can only be purposeful, and I totally agree with that. And that was actually from last October. So, and then finally, we as citizens need to become better informed on what's happening in D.C. And then, like I said earlier, this is why I started RAINMAN'S Take in the first place, to try and peel the onion back to get at what is really happening. We need to be informed about both sides of an issue so we can have a solid foundation for our positions. Getting our news from just one source no longer cuts it, in my view. We as citizens can help solve these problems, but we need to be informed and skeptical of what information we're being fed. So as it pertains to George Santos, I do hope he's found guilty of ethics and finance violations and is removed. I hope the people of that district in New York can vote again and hope they become more vigilant in the future about their candidates. That will go a long way towards fixing the problems we have in Washington, I believe. Now, do I think realistically any of these things are going to happen? Probably not. Number one actually needs a constitutional convention to actually change the Constitution. Number two, as it pertains to campaigning and campaign finance, etc., I think that system is so ingrained right now that it's going to be very difficult to wean ourselves off of the amount of money current elections are taking. We do have control over number three, and I really do hope that people can start to become more informed and start to become more skeptical and really take part in this whole process. So that's it for right now. That's what I wanted to kind of talk about with the George Santos situation in D.C. and how it is emblematic of the problems that I see that we have in D.C. right now. So I'll finish like I always do. If you're in the military, the police departments, fire departments, or first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for your service. Stay safe. We really appreciate everything you guys do. That being said, this is the Rain Man. I appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching RAINMAN'S Take, observations on the world we live in. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow RAINMAN'S Take on Instagram at RAINMAN'S Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.